Have you ever wondered what secrets your neighbors are hiding? Studies show that nearly 10% of violent crimes are committed by someone living next door. What if the friendly wave across the fence masks something far more sinister? Could the person you've trusted with a spare key be the very one to fear? Join me as I uncover some of the most chilling neighbor horror stories that will make you question who's living just a wall away. And if that's not enough, I'm challenging myself to spend a night alone in one of the creepiest neighborhoods imaginable. Will I make it until morning? Let's find out together. It started 2 months ago, shortly after I moved into my new apartment. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a rundown building, but it was affordable and quiet. At least that's what I thought. The first time I noticed her, she was standing in the window of the building across from mine. A middle-aged woman with stringy gray hair and a pale face, her eyes fixed directly on me. I assumed she was just staring out into the distance, lost in thought. I waved out of politeness. She didn't wave back. Days turned into weeks, and every time I glanced out my window, she was there, watching. Morning, noon, or night, it didn't matter. Her expression never changed, blank and unblinking, like she wasn't entirely there. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was lonely or had nothing better to do, but her presence started to make me uneasy. I began keeping the curtains closed, only peeking out occasionally to see if she was still there. She always was. One night, I stayed up late working on a project. It was around 2 a.m. when I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone's watching you. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the curtain just a crack. She wasn't in her window. Relief washed over me until I noticed something else. A shadow on the street below, moving slowly toward my building. It was her. She was walking with deliberate steps, her head tilted upward, staring directly at my window. I froze, heart pounding. My apartment door was locked, but the building's main entrance was old and flimsy. I rushed to double-check my door, bolting it and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. For hours, I sat on my couch clutching a kitchen knife, listening for any sound outside my door. None came. When dawn finally broke, I mustered the courage to look out the window again. She was back in her apartment, standing in the window like she'd never left. I told my landlord about her the next day, but he dismissed it. "Oh, that's just Mrs. Carver," he said with a dismissive wave. "She's harmless. A little off, maybe, but she's lived here for years. Harmless." That didn't explain the way she stared at me or her late-night walk to my building. Still, I tried to put it out of my mind. Maybe I was overreacting. That evening, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. It was written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. "You shouldn't leave your curtains open. They see you too." My stomach dropped. I tore the note into pieces and tried to convince myself it was a prank. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. At around 3 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on my window. I live on the 3rd floor. Heart hammering, I forced myself to look. The window was fogged up, but I could just make out the outline of a hand pressed against the glass. Then a face. Her face. I scrambled backward, falling out of bed. When I looked again, she was gone. The next morning, I packed a bag and left for a hotel. I told the landlord I was breaking the lease, and I didn't care about the penalty. I wasn't staying another night in that apartment. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to the building during the day, intending to grab the rest of my things. As I approached, I glanced up at her window. It was empty, the curtains drawn. Feeling emboldened, I asked one of the other tenants about her. "Mrs. Carver?" they said, looking confused. "She died over a year ago. Fell out of her window. 3rd floor." I felt the blood drain from my face. Her apartment's been empty ever since. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why she chose me. But sometimes, late at night, I feel that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck. And I wonder if she's still watching. never thought much about my neighbors. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, most interactions were limited to polite nods or an occasional wave. But then the house next door was sold, and everything changed. The new owner moved in late one night. I only noticed because of the glaring headlights that cut through my living room window. I peeked through the blinds and saw a tall, gaunt figure unloading boxes from a beat-up van. He worked methodically, stacking boxes with precision. No movers, no help, just him. By morning, the van was gone, and his house looked just as it always had, plain and unassuming. Except now, the curtains were drawn tightly across every window. I saw him for the first time in daylight when I was mowing my lawn. He stood on his porch, staring. Not at me exactly, but in my direction. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and dark, like he hadn't slept in weeks. I gave him a polite wave. He didn't wave back. That night, I woke up to the sound of faint tapping. It was rhythmic, almost like Morse code. At first, I thought it was coming from inside my house, but as I sat up in bed, I realized it was coming from outside, specifically his house. The noise stopped as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was just an animal or maybe the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next day, I noticed something odd. His mailbox, which had been empty the day before, was now stuffed to the brim with letters and packages. I hadn't seen a mail truck, and I was home all day. The strangest part? Some of the envelopes were yellowed, their edges frayed as if they'd been sitting in a damp basement for decades. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He never left the house. No lights ever turned on, yet the tapping continued every single night. Sometimes, it was accompanied by faint whispers, too muffled to make out. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take my dog, Max, for a walk past his house. As we approached, Max froze. His hackles stood up, and he let out a low, guttural growl. I tried to coax him forward, but he wouldn't budge. He just stared at the house, his tail tucked between his legs. It was then I noticed the door. It was open, just a crack. I don't know why I did it, but I stepped closer. The air around his house felt heavier, colder. Peering through the crack, I saw the interior was pitch black. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. Just an empty void. And then I saw them, eyes. Dozens of glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Max. As I scrambled to my feet, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I ran home, locking every door and window behind me. That night, the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and then it was on my walls, my ceiling, my bedroom door. I barely slept. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I called the police and told them everything. The noises, the eyes, the strange man who never left his house. When they arrived, they went next door to investigate. I watched from my window as they knocked on the door. No answer. Eventually, they forced their way in. I waited, my heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers emerged, his face pale. He waved me over. Hesitantly, I approached. The house was empty, completely barren. No furniture, no belongings. Just bare walls and a single room in the basement. The officer led me down the creaking steps, and what I saw will haunt me forever. The walls were covered in scratches, deep, jagged marks as if someone had been clawing at them for years. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair with thick leather straps bolted to the armrests. On the floor beneath it were chains, rusted and broken. "No one's lived here for decades," the officer said quietly. The previous owner was troubled. He kept claiming someone was watching him. When they found him, he'd scratched his own eyes out. I moved out of that neighborhood a week later. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that tapping. And when I do, I don't dare look outside. Have you ever had a neighbor who gave you chills? Share your own scary neighbor experiences or thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. And if you're craving more spine-tingling tales, click on the next video for another dose of eerie encounters. You don't want to miss it.